Welcome to the CIC webinar for, I think it's the last one for this quarter. And today we are having Professor Matt Conley to the talk today. And before he starts his talk, let me give you guys a quick introduction. So he obtained his bachelor degree in chemistry from University of Illinois at Chicago in 2004. And then he joined Richard Jordan's group at the University of Chicago for his PhD. And here he studied the isomerization mechanism of the Platen-2 complexes. And from 2008 to 2011, he pursued a postdoc at the ICIQ in Tarragona, Spain. And then after that, in 2011, Professor Conley moved to ETH in Zurich, Switzerland, to work in Christopher Corporat's group as a postdoc, and he worked on surface organometallic chemistry to synthesize well-defined heterogeneous classes, as well as characterization of supported species and molecular organometallic complexes using solid-state NMR. And in 2015, he joined the faculty at the University of California, Riverside, and his main research is focusing on generating active sites on surface that have well-defined structures to structure activity relationships. So today, Professor Conley is going to give us a talk on the organometallic perspective on surface functionalization. So let's welcome him again and enjoy the talk.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the introduction to be here, or for the invitation to be here to talk a little bit about our work. Since this is kind of more geared towards the center, which I see has a lot of interest in surface functionalization, I kind of pulled back a lot of this talk to kind of give a larger, broader perspective on not only what we do, but kind of how or where the field is. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are actually described in these two perspectives that came out in the last year or so. So if you just want to look up those papers and not pay attention to what I have to say, you're welcome to. So when I normally go out and give seminars, one of the slides I show is something like this. And I kind of pose the question, what's better, the finesse of the chemist or the brawn of the engineer? And I bring this up because if you look at a chemical plant or think about chemical engineers engaging with optimizing a chemical process, it doesn't really look like anything that we deal with in the lab. And if we think about, just a variety of Nobel Prize winning reactions, I didn't have a chance to update this with click chemistry, but if we think about all of the things that we know and love on the chemistry side of things, and, being a trained organometallic chemist, this is where I spend most of my time. We have, exquisite methods to control enantioselectivity, to engineer protein active sites, catalyze reactions that actually have industrial relevance. All of these things with discrete molecular control of whatever catalyst we're using. Whereas on the other side of the business, which I hate to admit this as a chemist, this is arguably much more important because these are done on scale. Most of the reactions that we're familiar with in the lab are normally done on, a few grams to kilograms. Whereas if you're doing, for example, metathesis of 2-butene and ethylene to make propylene, you're going to be doing this on a 1,000,000-ton scale or larger. So for the longest time, what we've been thinking about is how do we bring, the chemistry and the molecular control over to the engineers, basically give them the gift of chemistry. And lately, I've been kind of flipping that on the other side of things, because I actually think there's something we can learn from what they do over here to influence how we can design our catalysts and really leverage some of the abilities from the heterogeneous side to influence catalyst activity and reactivity. So I think using that as sort of a jumping or a starting point, we can kind of get into what I want to talk about today. So if we kind of take this all away and we just think about, these various catalysts, they have these materials that, at least as a trained organometallic chemist, we don't really spend a lot of time operating with. Titanium silicalite is a microporous molecular sieve type material, or a zeolite type material that's active in this reaction. We would never think about, how tungsten oxide interacts with silica, or how any of these various substrates would interact with these various materials. So That's something that I wasn't really aware of until I got into this field as a postdoc. And I think that it's a little daunting to think about how to handle the chemistry with things we don't know. But we have to keep in mind, as inorganic chemists, we've been doing things like this for a long time, basically reducing complex phenomena, such as how a phosphine binds to a nickel site. This isn't complex anymore, but back in the 70s, there were questions about how sterics and electronics affect selectivity in various reactions. And I think that's a really great starting point to think about how you can take something complex, a complex molecular phenomenon, and reduce it to two very simple parameters that then we can use to make progress. And I think if we use that similar sort of reductionist approach that we have, from Tolman angles and CO stretches, we can infer what some of these various surfaces should or should not do with inorganometallic substrate to think about how we can leverage how to use these sorts of materials to make our catalyst better. So this is kind of a busy slide. There's a lot of information on it. And I start with silica because silica, it pops up a few times on this slide. In the surface organometallic world, silica is really sort of the workhorse ligand. So instead of thinking about the complexities of silica, because silica is an amorphous material, very difficult to come up with accurate models that reflect the coordination environment of silica or the material properties of silica, we can use that similar reductionist mentality that Tolman taught us to just think about, what's on the surface, okay? Because inevitably, whatever we add to silica or any oxide is going to be bound to the surface selectively, okay? So silica surfaces, though they are extremely complex, we can simplify them quite quickly. So these are our surface images with DFT modeling by Sauer and Freund, where they grew vitreous silica on a ruthenium surface. And so this is a silica surface that really is just comprised of SiO-Si linkages. You get a variety of ring sizes where you have highly strained 4-membered rings to, the dominant less strained 6-membered rings that have various sort of, angles associated with them. So we know we're going to have a silica surface that has a whole bunch of SiO-Si bridges of various ring strains, and some of these can play a role in chemistry. But from an organometallic perspective, what's going to be doing most of the work are going to be the leftover silanols that come at the terminated surfaces of silica. We have 3 different flavors of silanol. We have the isolated silanol that is most commonly invoked in surface organometallic chemistry, a geminal silanol, and a vicinal silanol. We can control the silanol coverage just by thermally treating the silica support at a given temperature under vacuum. So the most traditional support used in this field is silica dehydroxylated at 700 degrees because it has approximately 1 SiOH per square nanometer. And the surface area of the material that we deal with, which is usually aerosol 200, which is a non-porous silica, would give us then a loading of about 0.26 millimole silanol per gram. There are a little bit of these left on the support as well, but mostly the isolateds, and the geminal silanols generally behave like isolated silanols in reaction chemistry. And so what we see, if we take silica dehydroxylated at a lower temperature, we see this broad bump that's reflective of these vicinal silanols. We heat to higher temperatures, that collapses because we're basically eliminating water and regenerating siloxane bridges, okay? How these interact with organometallics is dependent on the type of compound that you throw at it. So these are just some of the names of the people that are involved in this field. It really all started with Yermakov and Ballard that were looking at organometallic grafting reactions to mimic the active sites for Ziegler-Natta-olefin polymerization catalysts. So if you take your silica 700, react with some sort of organometallic, you generate this sigma bond metathesis type transition state where you're transferring a proton to the organometallic, and the metal is then making a metal oxygen bond to generate your well-defined site. If you have organometallics that contain metal carbon multiple bonds, and this is a classic example using Schrock's tris neopentyl neopentylidene in an elegant work by Basset. He showed that if you selectively label the silica to contain deuterated silanols, react it with the tantalum alkylidene, there's evidence for formation of this tetraalkyl site where the proton has been transferred to the tantalum carbon multiple bond, which is then followed by alpha elimination to generate your well-defined product. So these are sort of the 2 general grafting mechanisms that we normally think of when we're reacting an organometallic with an oxide surface. So then characterization is really the name of the game here. Now you'll notice I'm kind of drawing silica in two different coordination modes. If we reduce this to the sort of MLX conventions, this would be silica acting like an X-type ligand, and this is silica acting like an X-type ligand through the siloxide group and an L-type ligand through this dative interaction between a nearby siloxane bridge and the metal. It turns out both of these normally happen, and it's dependent on the steric properties of the metal. So one example that we looked at in my group was the reaction of bis CP star scandium methyl with silica 700. And we chose this because scandium has a really great NMR active nucleus where we could probe the coordination environment with respect to the scandium 45 NMR properties. So I don't want to go into detail about, why we see broad lines with scandium, just kind of take my word for it. If you see this experimental spectrum, you can fit this to two different sites. Those two different sites are reflective of the scandium being in sort of a low symmetry environment or a higher symmetry environment. The smaller CQ is reflected in the more tetrahedral geometry at scandium for this 4-coordinate species, and the larger CQ or the broader signal is associated with this 3-coordinate scandium species. The other way you can get information about silica behaving as this pure X-type or this LX type ligand is looking at how other features change when you react your organometallic with dehydroxylated silica. So one that came up as part of my postdoc and Christoph's group in collaboration with Laurent Moreau, Anne Lesage, and the late Dick Anderson was the reaction of this organolutetium compound with silica 700. These organolutetium compounds are interesting because they contain nearby secondary interactions with the proximal trimethylsilyl fragments. So these you can think of as a bridging silicon methyl lutetium group. And these distances, when you graft onto silica, contract quite significantly. Now, first, you'll notice that this is obviously a single crystal analysis. This is an XAPS analysis because you do have to go to a beamline to get these distances in on these supported species. But what we can kind of see here is that by substituting a metal carbon bond for a metal oxygen bond, we're contracting this distance. We're also including a nearby L-type interaction with silica, but essentially what's going on here is we're making lutetium more Lewis acidic by putting it on the silica surface, which intuitively makes sense because we're removing one metal carbon bond for a metal oxygen bond. So this LX type coordination environment is quite common for silica. I already mentioned this one that was characterized in detail, but here's a couple other examples by other groups that have shown that these are in fact in play. The other thing silica does is just rather prosaic. It restricts your ability to decompose bimolecularly. So I think the best examples of this behavior are really from Christoph's group. So this is a recent review describing all of the things that have been learned from making well-defined heterogeneous olefin metathesis catalysts. And all of this work is inspired by the sort of pure oxide-derived systems, notably the tungsten oxide on silica catalyst, which is responsible for about 1 million tons per year in the ethanolysis of 2-butene to make propylene. I didn't dwell on this much on the first slide, but this is a reaction that's thermoneutral, but because of the complications with generating the active site in this material, you have to operate at very high temperatures. So really the whole crux of this chemistry is, if you want to improve the properties of those catalysts, just incorporate a well-defined site by reacting it with silica to make, some congener that would be similar to what you feel is an intermediate for the tungsten oxide on silica material. So that's something we did in my postdoc as well. This catalyst is quite active. It's Z-selective for olefin metathesis. You put it onto silica or a related dialkoxide onto silica, it becomes significantly more active because you're sort of opening up the steric environment of the tungsten, because the silanols on silica, though you're on a bulky object, they behave like small ligands. And they also are very stable. And they're very stable because we've site isolated the tungsten oxoalkylidine. So we've shut down one of the bimolecular decomposition processes that are very common in these types of catalysts. And this is all by sort of understanding those very basic things, such as knowing your OH loading on the support and having some sort of reaction model to kind of guide you through the synthesis of one of these materials. So, this is kind of like, I guess I put this slide in as a way to segue to the next point. Like this shows you that by taking, some very simple parameters to guide how we can generate better catalysts for a typical homogeneous transition metal catalyzed reaction. Having similar models for surface functionalization can really help in bringing the molecular approach to a well-defined heterogeneous catalyst. So the world is bigger than silica. So here's common reactivity patterns of oxides broadly defined with organometallics. I'm leaving a couple reactions out that are less common. So the most common reaction is you take an organometallic, react with an oxide that's been partially dehydroxylated. So I just showed the example for silica, but you could imagine that that would apply for alumina or cerium oxide or titania or any oxide of your choosing. And depending on the nature of the oxide, you can generate two different products, okay? If you have the correct oxide or the appropriate oxide, which I'll show later, which is normally alumina, you can actually do an abstraction reaction, which is more akin to what you would see with a strong Lewis acid. So for this part of the talk, I want to talk about this top reaction here and talk about a different way to approach it as opposed to thinking about it in terms of Tolman parameters. I'm thinking about this in terms of acidity. As chemists, we learn about acidity at a very young age, in high school or general chemistry, depending on when you're first exposed to it. And if you think about this reaction here, it's essentially an ion pairing problem. And it's a question of, if we can control the acidity of the OH, we can essentially control whether we're over here, which we would expect for OHs that are weak acids, or we can be over here for OHs that we would predict are strong acids, okay? So acidity, I think we all know acidity as chemists. If we think about the dissociation of HCl in water, we can, measure the dissociation constant, pK, et cetera. But I think what's important to realize, and one of the challenges in this area, is that if you just want to think about acidity of an oxide, you can't really use how we think about acidity of the dissociation of HCl in water. And this is the reconstructed or the constructed Born cycle for that. It's composed of all of these various steps that are endothermic, but really the whole reaction chemistry is driven by the solvation of the proton and the solvation of the chloride ion. And, using this very simple scheme, we can understand why HCl behaves as a very strong acid in water, but a much milder acid in acetonitrile, because acetonitrile is not as good at solvating chloride ions as water is. But life is a little more complicated on an oxide surface because basically we have a different sort of square scheme to think about. And in essence, it's because we've removed all of these solvation terms. So we think about these in terms of deprotonation energy. These are normally values that we access using DFT methods of models that replicate the environment of the OH groups on a support. And then we can think about it of the reaction of that dissociated deprotonation energy reacting with some sort of base to form an ion pair. And it's really, this is the term that's hard to flesh out and separates this picture of acidity, which we're more familiar with acidity of Bronsted acidic surfaces. So one surface I like to focus in on in this context is sulfated oxides, because these are sort of first generation weakly coordinating anions for the surface organometallic world. And they have a very rich and controversial history, some of which was from early on in the 80s when Arata had first isolated these. And he had claimed that they were superacids. So now we're taking, and I just told you on the last slide that taking solution measures for acidity on oxides is inherently problematic. And the reason he came to this conclusion was that he made the sulfated oxide. This is how you make the sulfated oxides. They're actually very easy materials to make on 50-gram scales. So lab scales are quite trivial. And these are used as supports for olefin polymerization in some companies. So the reason they believed these were superacids was that you'd contact with a Hammett indicator, and you would get color changes, and that led them to the sort of false positive that these were in fact superacids, which created a lot of controversy in the literature for a number of years. And really, I think the real nail in the coffin started pretty early here with work by Joachim Sauer in the 90s, where he was looking at periodic models of zirconia surfaces absorbing in the gas phase sulfuric acid to generate the acidic sites. And what you can see here is if you have a fully dehydrated zirconium oxide surface, you absorb the sulfate ion, which heterolytically dissociates the proton onto a nearby ZRO-ZR bridge, which is satisfying because sulfuric acid is a strong acid and zirconium oxide is a weak base. So you're really seeing that in play here. However, if you take an organometallic, and now you react an organometallic with a site that looks something like this, you've now introduced a completely different parameter into the game. So indeed, Tobin Marks and Max Del Ferro have done a lot of really elegant work on this. This is a model of sulfated alumina, which is a bit different than the sulfated zirconia model I'm showing here. But what you can see here is this is a zirconium coordinated to two CP ligands, and there's a methyl group, and the zirconium is now interacting with a sulfate. Okay, so the zirconium never interacts with the basic ALO-AL bridges here for steric reasons. So essentially what you've done is you've created an ion pairing environment for a cationic organometallic. Okay. So when we got into this area, we were interested in looking at this acidity problem. And we quickly confirmed many of the suspicions that the sulfated oxides are not super acidic in any way, shape, or form. So what we did was we looked at these phosphine binding to the sulfated zirconia surface to generate these phosphonium ion pairs. And this was a very well-behaved system that allowed us to experimentally deduce that these are not superacids at all, because we could actually measure the equilibrium absorption constants using standard Langmuir type isotherm fitting expressions. And so what we can see is that as the X group on the phosphine becomes more electron donating, the pKa increases, which is exactly what you expect. So that's a solution measurement. And then we see that as we decrease pKa, the association constant of the phosphine goes down, which is exactly what you expect for a weak acid behaving, or for a weak acid interacting with a weak base. If sulfated zirconia was behaving like a superacid, we would expect irreversible binding for all of the phosphines studied here. And something that I think is kind of neat, I told you a couple slides ago, you can't really apply Hammett acidity type models to understanding surface acidity. But in this case, because we were slurrying these materials in acetonitrile, we have very nice linear behavior, very nice Hammett type behavior for phosphine binding to the sulfated zirconia surface. So with that in mind, I think determining the acidity of a surface, which is going to really translate into forming an ion pair or not, is typically done by absorbing some sort of base to the OH site. So I just showed an example with phosphines, and we are not the only one to use phosphines. I think we're the only ones who use those complex phosphines, but typically you absorb PME3 or something of that type to an oxide. Pyridine and monitoring FTIR or phosphine oxides and monitoring phosphorus 31 chemical shift. All of these are very valuable methods to sort of titrate the OH sites. So another method that we're interested in, because these are sort of single point measures, but they don't give you all of the information you want, because you get to a point where you protonate the phosphine irreversibly, and then you're kind of losing some characteristics about the ion pairing. So one thing we've been working on here is using a different chemical shift scale to translate something or give us some information about how an oxide would form an ion pair to an organometallic. And, I'm in labs that used to be occupied by Chris Reed, and Chris Reed is very well known for his sililium ion problem, where he was the first to isolate a pure sp2 hybridized sililium ion. And he had seen this sort of spectrum of behavior with sililium ions, where you have a free sililium ion, which is sort of the silicon analog of a carbocation. Silicon is larger and has longer silicon carbon bonds and a carbocation, so you can actually approach weakly coordinating anions to make these sililium-like species. And this is where a lot of the controversy about sililium ions sort of resulted in the early to mid 90s, where you start to distort from this pure sp2 hybridization to something that's in between here and the fully sp3 silane species. And it turns out the silicon NMR chemical shift of those species is all related to one another. So when you have silanes, you have shielded NMR chemical shifts. When you have a pure sililium, you have a very deshielded NMR chemical shift. And then you have everything in between along the spectrum between silane to the free sililium, where as you become more sililium-like, you gradually deshield the silicon NMR chemical shift. To be clear, this has nothing to do with charge on silicon. This has everything to do with the structure you're obtaining, because the silicon NMR chemical shift is related to the coupling of the silicon carbon bond to the empty p orbital on the silicon. And as you approach a 90-degree relationship between the silicon carbon and the empty orbital on silicon, you reach that sort of maximum paramagnetic deshielding that results in these chemical shifts. So when we started at UCR, the examples of silanes on surfaces were all over here. So silica capped with silyl groups, is shielded. Alumina capped with silyl groups is shielded. So these are essentially strongly coordinating anions, if you want to think about it in a purely heterolytic sense. The sulfated oxides that I just shown that behave as mild acids, but coordinate to transition metals to form ion pairs, when you react with silane reagents, you actually end up in a more de-shielded regime than you have for TIPS triflate. And I'll show later that these actually behave like sililium ions, so we're across that sililium-like threshold. If you try to engineer something that's more weakly coordinating, and we did that by reacting Ingo Crossing's strong Lewis superacid with silica dehydrated at 700, followed by reaction with a silane reagent to generate the sililium-like ion pair, we can even push further down towards these sililium-like ions. And I think using this methodology of thinking about ion pairing in terms of your silicon NMR chemical shift is a way to kind of open up how to handle ion pairing on surfaces from that organometallic perspective. So there's in fact a linear relationship with, or kind of a linear relationship. I'll give you that the R squared is not great and we don't have a lot of points on this line, but this is also kind of early days in this area because we really don't have many points to see how the, what the silicon NMR chemical shift is with respect to different oxides. If we use these sort of small molecular clusters or use available deprotonation energies that have been given in the literature, we can see that they fall roughly on the same line as typical molecular anions that have deprotonation energies and known silicon NMR chemical shifts of their respective sililium or silane. So this is something that we're looking to build on to generate more weakly coordinating surfaces to really get at these sort of weakly coordinating environments that we can use regularly in the molecular community. So then ultimately you want these things to do something, right? I mean, you go through all the trouble to generate these models for ion pairs. You want to show that they, showcase that they have some sort of effect. So I think you'd have to kind of be living under a rock somewhere to not know that we have a problem with plastic waste. And I'll use this as an example to showcase what you can get by engineering charge into your well-defined organometallic site. So this is an image that I took off Flickr. I think this was off the coast of Portland or something. And I think that all of these were actually recovered from the ocean. So obviously not a good thing. So there's a big push in the organometallic community to figure out ways where we can chew up plastics into smaller constituent units that can ultimately be converted back to the monomer to make a more circular economy for these types of materials that, though they have a lot of bad uses, they also have a lot of good uses as well. So the main way that we have approached this and others have approached this is through this catalytic cycle shown here that was originally shown by Jean-Marie Basset and has been used by, I show this paper by Max Telfero and Aaron Sadow, and Tobin Marks has been using this as well recently. I left his off by accident. So a zirconium hydride supported on silica, which is, of these two types, or on silica alumina, will react by sigma bond metathesis with a polymer to form your alkyl group that undergoes beta alkyl elimination, followed by subsequent hydrogenation steps to result in a lower molecular weight alkane product. And you can really keep this running until you converge all the way to methane and ethane with these zirconium systems. You obviously don't want to run it that far, but you can. And these are purely statistical in nature because you're driven by this beta alkyl elimination event that happens statistically dependent on the metal itself. The tantalum sites down here also engage in this reaction chemistry, but both of these neutral materials, which are excellent in their own right, show very slow reaction rates. And so we were kind of inspired by work from Aaron Sadow's PhD thesis with Don Tilley. This is one of the really excellent examples, I think, that shows the effects of charge on a sigma bond metathesis reaction. A neutral CP star CP hafnium dimethyl reacting with phenylsilane, nothing happens. You make the triflate, which is sort of your first generation weakly coordinating anion. There's no reaction, and that's because the triflate is bound to the hafnium center, and this is a neutral hafnium species. If you ionize it with the stronger Lewis acid, you form this weakly coordinating contact ion pair, and then this reaction becomes instantaneous, or within 5 minutes, the reaction is complete. So we were going into this thinking like, okay, we have all these ways of knowing that we can engineer charge into a metal site. We have no idea which step in this cycle is slow, but sigma bond metathesis should be faster. And it's known that if you have cationic organometallics, these steps should be faster as well. So maybe we can accelerate a reaction just by engineering a hydride onto one of these weakly coordinating supports. And so this is something we've been working on recently. So here now we're working with sulfated alumina. Sulfated alumina is related to sulfated zirconia, but there are some key differences which have been studied by Del Ferro and Dave Caffin at Argonne National Lab. So these again contain mildly acidic protons nearby sulfate groups. And so what we do is we react this dehydrated surface with the tris-neopentyl neopentylidine. And what we form are these dialkyl tantalum sites. The way we think this happens is we protonate the alkylidine, which is analogous to what has been shown for silica. And then nearby OHs react with this reactive electrophilic tetraalkyl fragment to form the trialkyl organometallic that's nearby an ALO-AL bridge that opens this by alkyl transfer to generate our dialkyl organometallic. In this sort of structure, you would expect 3 C alpha carbons if you selectively C13 label the organometallic at the C alpha, and that's exactly what you see. You see 3 chemical shifts that are characteristic of these 3 different sites. You react this material with H2, we see 10 equivalents of methane come off per tantalum because the neopentane that we generate in that reaction is being converted to methane or is undergoing the hydrogenolysis reaction as we form the hydride. We can see this directly through FTIR. We can see the formation of ALH bands, and we see the formation of TAH bands. When we contact with D2, those disappear, showing that these are, they behave like metal hydrides. When we do hydrogenolysis reactions with tetradecane, so tetradecane we use as sort of an alkane surrogate for polyethylene. We can see immediately that we have much greater reactivity for the sulfated, for the tantalum hydride on sulfated alumina and hydrogenolysis reactions. So this is after 2 hours at 150 degrees. We fully convert all of the tetradecane to a distribution of alkanes, some of which are gases, most of which are liquids. If we let this run at longer temperatures or at higher loadings, this all goes to methane, which is exactly what you expect for these types of metal hydrides. If we compare that directly under the same exact conditions using tantalum hydride on silica, we convert significantly less tetradecane, and we get a completely different distribution of products out of the hydrogenolysis reaction. One of the unique features of the tantalum hydrides that distinguishes them from zirconium hydrides is their ability to catalyze the metathesis of alkanes. The metathesis of alkanes involves dehydrogenation and alpha elimination steps to generate alkylidines that undergo olefin metathesis and subsequent hydrogenation reactions to generate a distribution of alkane fragments. So again, we see the tantalum hydride on sulfated alumina is significantly more active in this reaction than the tantalum hydride supported on silica, which is in line with the hypothesis that installing charge on the metal should affect these various rates. So how do these reactions work? So the GC of a typical alkane metathesis reaction using our catalyst here, this is what we observe. We can assign all of these as the linear alkane. The branched alkanes, we do generate little bits, but not much. Okay, so if you compare that to the neutral tantalum hydride on silica, you get significantly more branching in your GC traces, suggesting that there could be a difference in selectivity for the sigma bond metathesis reaction. So for the hydrogenolysis pathway, we think we're probably going for a primary CH and then undergoing chain walking to that eventually undergoes statistical beta alkyl elimination and subsequent hydrogenation to give us our products. We can't currently rule out direct CH activation of a secondary carbon, but when I see this from the alkane metathesis reactions, that suggests to me that there's a lower barrier to activation of the primary CH3 group compared to the secondary CH2, which I think is totally reasonable based on everything known about sigma bond metathesis reactions. For the alkane metathesis reactions, we must be activating the primary CH3 group, because if you If you activate the secondary group, that would install a branch in your final product. So we think we're getting these dialkyls that undergo beta H elimination, followed by alpha H elimination to give us the olefin alkylidine intermediates that undergo olefin metathesis and subsequent hydrogenation to give us our linear product shown here. This does work with polyethylene as well. It doesn't work as well. We can get about a 30% yield in hydrogenolysis reactions, and we can also convert broad molecular weight polymer products to narrow molecular weight products using the alkane metathesis reaction. So I talked a lot about, kind of controlling this reaction here. Now I want to settle in on this reaction where we're using the Lewis acidity of a support to do an abstraction reaction. And this is analogous to methionine abstraction that we see in the organometallic world when you want to activate like a D0 organometallic to make an ion pair with tris-pentafluorophenylborane. So I bring this up in the context of, I just showed you sort of some of our efforts to try to solve a problem. Now I'll show you some of our efforts where we contribute to the problem, because a lot of the chemistry that involves this sort of methionine abstraction is really inspired by the olefin polymerization results discovered by Ziegler and Nada, 75 years ago or so. Really the understanding of how these first generation Ziegler type catalysts that have evolved into more advanced mixtures of metallocene oxides and alkyl aluminums, how they evolve to form the active sites onto an oxide. And so in some of the first generation sort of insights into this, taking alkyl zirconiums reacting with silica or alumina, you get these wildly different polymerization rates. More modern techniques using solid state NMR shows that one of the reasons for that is, if you take alumina and you dehydrate it at very high temperatures, you basically unmask Lewis acid sites that form these ion pairs. That was first shown by Tobin Marks in the 80s. This was this paper was published about 6 months before the isolation of the bis-CP zirconium methyl THF adduct, cationic THF adduct by my PhD advisor. You can also do this with alumina dehydrated at lower temperatures too. So I put this in the context of a catalyst that we've studied in collaboration with Chevron Phillips. This is not a catalyst that they use commercially, but it is representative of sort of state-of-the-art heterogeneous catalyst for olefin polymerization, where you take a metallocene, an oxide, and an alkyl aluminum, and then you make the polymer. And these are very active catalysts, though I'm told by my minders at CP Chem these aren't that active. And there's some important notes here. First is that the TIBA to zirconium ratio is about 12:1. There's a good amount of zirconium in the feed, but barely any zirconium absorbs to the support. So we knew that we were kind of in it for a difficult problem. And to make a long story really short, this is the network of reactions that happens in this incredibly complex system. This was all work done by my very talented, he was my first PhD student, Damian Culver. He's now a staff scientist at Ames National Lab. So everything starts with TIBA. TIBA passivates all the OH groups on the aluminum oxide surface. These look like partially hydrolyzed aluminum alkyls because that's what they are. So we were nervous that these were actually the activators responsible for the olefin polymerization chemistry. We contact with the metallocene dichloride, then ethylene, and nothing happens. So that we can rule that out pretty quickly. On the other side of the coin, we have excess TIBA in solution, excess enough TIBA in solution that we passivate all the OHs on the alumina surface, and there's still enough TIBA left to react with the metallocene, which upon mixing and walking down to the NMR spectrometer converts to a mixture of two different hydride products. This product shown here was characterized by Brissinger and Burkhaw about 15 or 20 years ago as the reaction product of this metallocene with dibol. So if we selectively make this hydride react with our TIBA functionalized alumina, we also don't get polymer. If we take this hydride, which we can generate independently from a known dihydride dimer and appropriate amounts of organoaluminum compounds, we can make this in solution. We put it on TIBA alumina. It becomes very active in polymerization. If we take the dihydride without the exogenous alkyl aluminums, we generate this ion pair as well with a slightly higher loading of zirconium, which is what we then use to study in more detail. So knowing what we knew going into this, we assumed we had something like this, where we have this ion pair that's that would be prepared by hydride abstraction by a Lewis acidic aluminum, okay? So, indirect evidence that we form this, we react our reactive site, which we've deuterated. with cis-dichloroethylene. This was chosen on purpose because this is engineered to undergo one insertion reaction and a beta chloride elimination to generate deuterated products that we could then characterize. This would also provide us a measure of active sites, because if we can quantify the amount of deuterated products, which we know must come from the zirconium D, we have a way to kind of track this using this labeling strategy. So just by quantifying the amount of D in the products, which you can kind of see here from the collapse of the vinyl chloride coupling, this is proteovinyl chloride, this is the monodeuterovinyl chloride. We can establish that about 24% of the ZRD sites undergo olefin insertion in this reaction, which is significantly higher than what had been previously proposed for these types of catalysts, these types of heterogeneous catalysts. We also generate a whole lot of proteovinyl chloride and isobutene. We don't see any evidence of a sort of isobutyl zirconium, which would come off as this product. So what we believe is happening here is we're taking our cationic zirconium deuteride. It's reacting with the cis-dichloroethylene, doing exactly what we want to make the deuterated chloride or deuterated vinyl chloride. Then this deactivated zirconium chloride cation, which cannot propagate polymer, is statistically close to a bunch of partially hydrolyzed aluminum alkyls on the surface. And this we know from mass balance and tracking everything going on in the reaction. So this is just a realkylation step that then releases isobutene to generate a zirconium hydride, and that generates our proteovinyl chloride. And then if this is correct, you would expect that you would have a roughly 1-to-1 ratio of these two products, which you can kind of eyeball from the proton NMR as what's going on here. I should note, this is an incredibly challenging reaction at these sorts of loadings. This signal here is the C13 satellites of the excess cis-dichloroethylene. So this was really a monumental task to figure out, and Damien did a great job doing that chemistry. So as far as characterizing this, we were kind of at a standstill because, you know, proton solid state NMR is difficult. So we wanted to see how we could characterize this using deuterium solid state NMR. Deuterium solid state NMR is, proton solution to deuterium solution NMR, I think, is pretty straightforward. In the solid state, this is the typical spectrum you would get out of, this zirconium deuteride precursor, which is what we use to prepare the ion pair I just shown. This region here is your isotropic chemical shift information that you would report, in any supporting information. These spinning side bands appear at integers of the rotor frequency, and the magnitude of these spinning side bands is related to the quadrupolar coupling constant, which is related to one term of the EFG tensor, which is characteristic of the chemical environment of your deuteride. There's also an asymmetry parameter that is essentially how all three terms in this EFG tensor kind of play off each other. So for bridging zirconium deuterides, we have small quadrupolar coupling constants and eta greater than 0, which is exactly what we expect based on this review by Leslie Butler. And the terminal zirconium deuterides have characteristic chemical shifts as well. Or I'm sorry, quadrupolar coupling constants as well. So then we made the monomer, we ionized the monomer by just bulking up the CPs to CP stars. And you can see that you have this massive effect on quadrupolar coupling constants. So this is going up by a large margin. This isn't like some trick of hand. This is the powder pattern or the fitting for the raw data for the zirconium deuteride cation. This is what we see for the neutral CP star dimer. This is clearly narrower than this one. So then we go into this with a model. This is what we should have. We should have a CQ that's small with an eta greater than 0 for this bridging deuteride, and then a terminal deuteride with a large CQ eta of 0. We run the experiment. We had to go to Santa Barbara to do this at higher field. We end up seeing only one peak, and we kind of beat our heads on this for a while, thinking about, why is it one peak? And it's, the same thing that happens in solution NMR happens in solid state NMR. If you're just seeing one peak, cool it down. So it took a while for us to do this because of the COVID lockdowns, but when we finally got NMR time to do this up at EMSL at minus 100 degrees, you can see this peak here, which is the composite of these two signals. We cool to minus 100. We split these into two signals, as you would expect. One at a chemical shift that is absolutely consistent with a zirconium hydride cation with a large CQ and eta of 0, and the other consistent with an aluminum deuteride anion with a smaller CQ with an eta that is greater than 0. That indicates that these two deuteriums are undergoing chemical exchange. We don't know the chemical exchange mechanism, right? One possibility is just fast reversible ionization. The other is that this ion pair breaks by the zirconium hydride falling onto a nearby ALO-AL bridge and then recombines on the other side of the aluminum, or you could have a four-center transition state as well on the zirconium that could account for this. So one question that kind of came out of this is that, okay, we have these examples here where you can ionize with a Lewis site, but these Lewis sites aren't normally present on very high surface coverages. They're difficult to characterize. Simply, can we generate a high surface coverage of aluminum Lewis acid sites? And this turns out to be a relative challenge in the area. So we go back to silica 700, sort of our baseline ligand in this area. And all we have to do is react some Lewis acid that can liberate HX to form a well-defined Lewis site. So the inorganic chemist's favorite Lewis acid is tris-pentafluorophenylborane. If you react this with silica 700, it will actually reversibly absorb to the silanols. So you can trap that by protonating with an aniline base. And that's work by Jean-Marie Basset and by John Walzer at Exxon, which predates this work. You can also react with silica dehydrated at lower temperatures that undergoes a complex reorganization cascade to generate these pairs of Lewis sites, but they're incapable of reacting with organozirconiums. So we've been looking at this reaction of Crossing's Lewis superacid with silica, and it's been quite fortuitous because depending on your reaction conditions, you can get very strong Bronsted acid sites, or you can get the Lewis acid site shown here if you change solvent and you mildly heat. So we've made the well-defined Lewis site. I'm not going to dwell on the characterization. It does the alkyl abstraction chemistry that we're interested in just by looking at the carbon NMR. We have 4 C13 labeled peaks. This is for the zirconium alkyl cation. This peak here is for the reaction of residual silanols with the bis-CP zirconium dimethyl. This site here is from the alkyl silanes that form from alkyl transfer on nearby siloxane bridges. And then this is the aluminum methyl site, which we can unambiguously confirm using this Resptor experiment, which reintroduces aluminum dipolar coupling under MAS and results in signal loss, which we can then unambiguously establish that this is the aluminum methyl, but we can also then extract a distance of this aluminum methyl as well. And that's done in collaboration with Aaron Orsini's lab at Ames. So we kind of have this nice analogy now between the Lewis sites and an industrial heterogeneous catalyst and relating it to a well-defined system, and then a sort of Lewis acidic abstraction that we would do in solution. So, we've got 2 different ways to form ion pairs, and I would bet, if I were to poll the audience, most people, if I asked them how to make an ion or a cation in solution, you're going to go for a silver salt, and you'll notice that's not available up here, okay? That's just not in our toolbox. I brought this up to one visitor at one point. He said, actually, we would use thallium. So thallium is another great example for this halide abstraction. So we don't have a real halide abstraction methodology in our toolbox. So silurium ions will actually do the same chemistry. This was originally reported by Reed about 15 years ago, and it has been lately repopularized by the single molecule magnet community. And, approaching this from something that I kind of already showed you, we know how to make these sort of silurium-like surface species. So I mentioned that these would come back. These do behave like silurium ions. So a silurium ion is expected to activate CF bonds in the presence of silanes to make alkanes. And if you have our silurium-like species on sulfated zirconia, indeed, it'll do that for the activated products. And it's significantly more reactive than, at the time, the state-of-the-art heterogeneous catalyst, but significantly less active than what you would observe with, a carborane anion. So these are also pretty easy to make. I literally have an undergrad that can make this on scale. This is the reaction that we're doing. This is a solid-state silicon NMR showing that we can generate these silurium-like species with very high purity. This is the silurium ion. There's a little bit of silyl ether on the support as well, but it's quite clean. And these react very nicely in halide abstraction reactions. For historical reasons, we went to this diimine, this bulky diimine palladium methyl chloride. There's a lot of information we could extract from this one experiment. You could expect that the silurium could go for the chloride or the methyl. So we only see TIPS chloride in solution and no triisopropyl methyl, which makes sense because silurium ions have some of the highest halide ion affinities that are known. We also see that we have 1 palladium on the support per triisopropyl chloride evolved by correlating the amount of TIPS chloride that comes off in solution and the amount of palladium by ICP analysis. What I'm showing here is a really complex NMR experiment that was done in collaboration with Fred Paris at Ames National Lab. This is a proton fluorine experiment where he's able to take these parameters and use this dipolar dephasing curve, which is similar to that aluminum experiment I just mentioned. And he's able to fit this to a single parameter, which is the palladium aluminum distance, which turns out to be fits very well to 11 angstroms, which is precisely what you expect for a bulky weakly coordinating anion interacting with a bulky weakly coordinating cation. These diamine sites are excellent polymerization catalysts. Through active site titrations, we know that almost all of the observable palladium methyl sites are reactive to vinyl chloride, so that's sort of our active site count. We can generate very high molecular weight branched polyethylene and very high molecular weight polyethylene that incorporates polar monomers. This is still a diamine cation, so it still has all of the challenges associated with a typical Brookhart catalyst. But since it's on the support, we're also getting significantly higher molecular weight as well, which is something we didn't really expect. So this halide abstraction methodology is really general. We can basically abstract any halide that we want. We're just limited by our creativity. This is kind of an old slide, but I'm just showing some examples of some of the things that we can do with this reaction chemistry. And with that, I hope that I've shown you that, we can think about these things in kind of using the simple parameters that have hopefully been introduced to many of you through the graduate curriculum, into delineating this really complex behavior that happens when you take an organometallic and react with a surface, using these simple methodologies where we can ascribe acidity or Lewis acidity and sort of track these empirically using various spectroscopic methods. And so, I think, how far can we push this model? We obviously want to go to other oxides that we haven't explored. Something we've been doing in collaboration with my colleague, Elena Bekirova, is thinking about this in terms of how we can functionalize carbon surfaces, for example. So she was in Bob Haddon's lab for the longest time, who's a very well-known carbon scientist. And he's been talking about the functionalization of carbons in a similar way to how you would generate, think about carbons or think about how the orbitals on benzene would interact with a metal. So if you basically take the E2U and the E1G orbitals of benzene and you put those into sort of a band type structure, these are the orbitals you would get for graphene, which are degenerate because you basically have no band gap at the Dirac point. So that can explain why most of the organic functionalization chemistry introduces defect sites at sort of well-defined positions because of the orbital population in these two states. And what he was able to show is that if you complex something like bis-benzene chromium or benzene chromium tricarbonyl, you can generate well-defined graphenes. And if you put those on single-walled carbon nanotubes, you can conserve the optical properties, and you can get these very interesting conductive networks that are different from what you see with, just doped lithium carbons, because you're now promoting not just intratube electron transport, but intertube electron transport, because this chromium site is very good at bridging the bands of two single-walled carbon nanotubes. So I think that if we kind of take this molecular approach and use this to describe how other surfaces can interact with metals, we can use a lot of the things that are kind of already in our toolboxes in organic chemists. So with that, I'd like to thank the people that have done the work. You've seen many of their names on the slides. This is kind of a dated group photo, but there's really only one or two people left off of it. So Kavya is the author of one of the perspectives that I just mentioned, and she also did some of the Lewis acid work. Jessica did some of the titration work and some other things I didn't have a chance to talk about. Zhao Xin did the tantalum and the palladium work, and Damien did a lot of the Chevron Phillips work. So I'd like to thank all of these collaborators that have been helpful for various points in this endeavor. These funders for the money. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'd be happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Professor. If the students have any questions, you can just either raise your hand or just unmute.
I guess it's only me, so I'll go first. I just have actually a couple questions on something you mentioned pretty early on in the talk. So, in thinking about preventing those biomolecular deactivation pathways by putting the catalyst on the surface, I'm wondering if it's ever been a problem for someone if you get too high of loading, if those biomolecular deactivation pathways become feasible again. And then sort of follow up to that, I know organosilane functionalized catalysts, they can be a bit flexible, and I'm wondering how relatively flexible are like just direct oxide functionalized catalysts.
Yeah, so you kind of game the system to avoid the high surface coverage. So to kind of answer your first question, you know that most of the bimolecular decomposition reactions are going to happen at the metal. So if you really template the oxide to have a low surface coverage of the OH sites, you just kind of inherently prevent that. You are correct, though, that if you go to a lower dehydration temperature, which means a higher surface coverage of OHs, you can end up in situations where you form dimers or trimers or aggregates. There's also other situations where if you react with highly reactive main group compounds, such as trialkyl aluminums, you'll just completely reorganize the silica surface to get to a thermodynamic minimum. So these are sort of a case-by-case thing that you have to intuit based on what's out there. But generally speaking, most transition metals, you can shut down the bimolecular pathways just by virtue of having that templated low surface coverage of OH sites.
Gotcha.
With respect to silanes on surfaces, so I didn't really talk about that, but if you engineer flexible linkers that contain, you know, ligands that can bind to your metal, you can still get dimers even if you really try to promote very low surface coverage of the ligand. So that's something that was a bit surprising to me, but that was, I think Christoph Kopere just published a paper on that recently, looking at some palladium NHC systems that I was also involved with as a postdoc, where we had originally thought that these were really single site palladium NHC systems, but then using more advanced NMR spectroscopy, it looks like there's a significant contaminant of bis NHC platinum species. So with those, you have to be a little bit more careful, to make a long story short.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions from students?
Can I ask a quick question, Shiyun?
Yeah.
Related to Brandon's. Matt, I actually, maybe you had it and maybe I missed it. What is the loading? Like, because Brandon asked, oh, can you get to dimerization? We've tried a few, you know, to support a few compounds, and we get very low loading. So, you know, a few weight percent at the most.
Yeah, that's about right.
So, so then I guess, is there a case where you actually do have too much loading? I mean, do people ever manage to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends what you're after, right? So like if you're after like the sort of surface organometallic way that I just showed, you're always going to be limited by the accessibility of the OHs and the surface coverage of the OHs. So you're always going to be limited to a few weight percent of your metal loading, which honestly is pretty good in terms of activity per metal. So when we typically report these things in terms of activity, we put mole product per mole metal to help, you know, benchmark that versus something in solution. As far as achieving higher loadings, it really depends on what you want to do. So there's a whole swath of heterogeneous catalysis that involves, you know, incipient wetness impregnation with metal salts and then cooking up those metal salts under various conditions.
No, I mean like organometallic stuff.
Yeah, so if you want organometallic stuff, you're always going to be at the low weight percentage regime if you want to get these things to behave similarly to how they behave in solution.
Okay, that does make me feel better. But so going into this, like,
one way to get around that, if you really are limited by looking at these because you have, like, I don't know, 3 weight percent metal on a given silica, you can increase the surface area of your support. That'll increase your weight percentage, but then you still get a lot of the same properties. So that's one way to do it.
So go to nanoparticles, basically, or stuff like
that.
that.
Or like, you know, like the one that we would typically use would be like SBA 15. That's 1,000 square meters per gram. Very easy to make. You can put ligands in that and get pretty good behavior. Of course, then you're dealing with a situation where you have a mesoporous pore environment. So then you have diffusion of reagents that could kind of be rate limiting in some of your catalytic reactions. But there's been a lot of work done on pore engineering to kind of to handle that.
Okay, thank you.
And faculty ask questions?
There,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. I'll
Ready?
pass forward to yeah, Troy.
Okay,
You can go ahead.
Yeah. Matt, nice question. Nice talk. And I have a question. Maybe kind of actually it's two questions. First one is more technical. Is maybe detailed. Is in the last part of it, you talks about the from the tie binding model of the MO diagram of the graphene and how that would the chromium functionalization do it. I mean, okay, I guess what you are trying to say is that the graphene from a tie binding model, the local high PZ orbital pattern is analogous to the benzene one. So therefore, there's a chance that you can make that analogy and determine what kind of functionalization can happen. Is that a philosophy based on taking pieces out of the frontier orbital while band edge of the tie binding model?
Yeah. So I have to be. Yes, you are totally right. So that is not my work. That's really all of Bob Haddon's sort of view on how he is viewed functionalizing or utilizing these materials. He always took that view of the sort of organic chemist that built towards a band structure, and it's a pretty predictive model. So he's published quite a bit, or he did publish quite a bit on that. There's a very good perspective in JOC from I think 2015 that kind of gives his view of how these carbon surfaces can be understood using simple molecular orbital analogies.
Oh, it's kind of funny that the band structure you just drew is what I teaching when I try to teach advanced inorganic, how the MO diagram migrate to Hoffman's entire binding model in solid state. I mean, that's the reason I got my attention. But to some extent, it kind of makes sense. I'm not sure how predictive they are in reality.
Yeah. Well, you know, it is predictive in some cases. So if you look at the reaction of like aryl diazoniums, which generate aryl radicals, you can kind of predict where the patterning should be based on that.
Okay.
So in some cases you can. Now, I think with transition metals, like what I showed you weren't crystal structures, right? Those are just DFT derived models. So, you know, how well they represent reality.
I see.
But you know, I think it's a model that still needs some expansion in the transition metal world, or the sort of metal-based thinking about metal-based functionalization. But for organics, I think it works pretty well.
Okay. I have a second question, maybe a little bit. I think I'd ask you, but I still keep thinking that when I asked you when I visited Riverside last year, but I also keep thinking about that it's the same. I mean, you know, in materials community, people talks about single atom catalyst, and literally it's like putting a metal in a certain ligand framework and to see the reactivity. So in a broader concept, it's the same thing about putting organometallic compound on surface, or where distinction comes from? What's the distinguishing from your perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So like my last NSF grant was all about halide abstraction, and I sold it as single cationic sites because the single atom community is really kind of taken over. They haven't taken over, but they have such a wide following. You know, the biggest limitation I see with single atom catalysts is your surface coverage of metal has to be extremely low. Most of the single atom catalysts focus on, you know, rhodium or platinum or iridium sites deposited on some redox active oxide. And I think some of the best methods to generate them were by Phil Christopher, who used to be at UCR, but is now at UC Santa Barbara. And he had a very simple way to make these. You know, you just dilute out your metal such that you have one metal per titania nanoparticle. There are some other promising ways to think about accessing single atom catalysts. I think they're quite interesting, but you're kind of limited on what you can do spectroscopically to study them. The difference between a single atom catalyst and what I showed here is that I'm basically installing functionality, because like we're still left over with some sort of inherent metal carbon bond or metal based reactivity that we can subsequently do without some sort of initiation into the catalytic cycle. Most single atom catalysts, and I don't want to say all, because I'm sure there's some that you can, directly react into whatever catalytic cycle you're interested in. But many of those you have to, kind of activate under the reaction conditions. So you don't get a lot of bang for your buck. You're kind of in the traditional heterogeneous world where you might have a well-defined starting material, but you still have to activate it to a high energy intermediate to do the chemistry. The organometallic world, the potential energy is already installed.
Yeah. Well, I can tell where those two come from different starting point, but it's kind of intriguing that they kind of convergency among those two gradually. Not there yet, but there is a trend.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I actually find a lot of the single atom catalysis world, that's probably the most interesting subset of the traditional heterogeneous catalysis community. And the one that I find, and I agree with you, I find the most analogy between what they do and what I do, and I can see a relationship to the chemistry.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Matt, can I ask a question, Shui?
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, I really enjoyed your talk. I have a technical question. Your solid state NMR seems to be really powerful in characterizing the sites. What kind of sample requirements, or what kind of samples are suitable for solid state NMR? I'm curious.
Yeah, so anything that's not magnetic, right, or conductive, like that's step one. You can still kind of get around that. If you have a conductive material, you can dilute it with like boron nitride and still get MAS NMR data. As far as like sample amount, we typically use 4mm NMR rotors. So I think the internal volume of a 4mm NMR rotor is like 50 or 60 microliters. So it's not a huge amount of material that you need, but you do need, depending on the density of your material, between like 30 and 150 milligrams.
So you mentioned exhausts, you mentioned solid state NMR. Are there any other techniques that can help you corroborate the DFT results? I'm curious.
Yeah, so IR can be useful in some cases. So I showed, let me see if I can get back to it. I showed an example. So this Bronsted acid site has a characteristic OH stretch. It has a characteristic proton NMR chemical shift, a characteristic aluminum NMR set of properties. And we developed a small cluster that's just based off a polysequisiloxane model, where we basically put on this Lewis acid, and then all of those parameters fit very well to what we were seeing experimentally. So I would always add IR to the list of analytical techniques that we can use, but it comes with a caveat that you often don't get very conclusive information from IR. You can see CH bands. Sometimes you can see one band in the aromatic region that infers something about acidity. You could see a CO band or a specific OH band, but it's kind of limited in that respect. So you had mentioned Zanes and XAPs, and I had alluded to that as well. You could do XPS is another method that can work for these. Though I must admit, it's a technical issue with this particular class of sample, because you always expose it to air at some point. And that kind of eliminates that as a useful method in most cases. There's also EPR. If you have spin active materials, you could do squid, just like you would do for organometallic single molecule magnets. Most of the analytical techniques that I would be familiar with as a molecular inorganic chemist do translate pretty well to the solid state, with various complications here and there.
Thank you. Very helpful. Really enjoy this.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions from students or professors?
Can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead. Yes,
So I was really interested in your results with the palladium diamine immobilized catalyst. Do you think there's a possibility that there could be surface interaction with the polar monomers, like the MA, as a way to kind of get around the typical problems associated with the homogeneous polymerization?
That is an excellent question, and one that I totally want to explore, because you could imagine that, like, if we could generate a surface that has like a nearby Lewis site, maybe we can force it to open the chelate and make it go. We just haven't been able to do that yet. But yeah, that's an excellent idea, and trying to leverage the surface to solve some of these problems, I think, is a promising strategy. Installing a Lewis site, we know how to do that. Installing the weakly coordinating site, we know how to do that. We just haven't combined it in one system yet.
And how does the activity change? Because you're getting very good molecular weight, but and the MA incorporation here, I guess, is a little bit low.
Yeah, so MA incorporation with all of the supported sort of single site palladium or nickel catalyst is always a bit lower than what you get in solution. Activity, again, if you go by, mole product per mole metal, these are actually comparable to what you would get with the same catalyst in solution. Now, it's difficult to compare them side by side if you take them from the literature, but I think in this particular paper, we looked at this catalyst in our reactor, and we saw in solution and on the support, we had essentially the same activity. I will also note, I kind of left this off the slide because it's a detail, but since you're bringing it up, these are actually bimodal molecular weight polymers. So I'm showing the higher molecular weight fraction, which is the predominant fraction in the material product, but we also generate a very low molecular weight fraction as well. So some of these palladium sites are prone to doing your classical alkyl transfer chemistry, and some are not. There's this relationship on silica-supported catalysts where you always kind of have this 70-30 mixture. So 70% where the silica surface is acting like a pure X-type ligand, and 30% where it's behaving as an LX-type ligand. In this particular system, silica is purely an L-type ligand, but it's still an amorphous support, different chemical environments that we really don't know how to probe. So I suspect what we're seeing in that sort of bimodal molecular weight properties of these polymers is just related to the local chemical environment of the palladium site. We do know from that the polar monomer is incorporated in the highest molecular weight fraction and the lowest molecular weight fraction, so we don't have a bias there. But that's something that we haven't figured out how to really engineer in yet, how to control that to make these, more bimodal, less single site, more single site.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I saw a jet. Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Hey, Matt, that was fantastic. Thanks for the great talk. My question is related to the hydrogenolysis work of polyolefins that you talked about. I remember when the Basset chemistry came out when I was in graduate school, and I always thought that was remarkable chemistry. And it's really nice to see that you've kind of taken it a little bit further. My question is, what happens with different classes of polyolefins? So sounds like you're predominantly looking at high density polyethylene. You don't have the polyethylene data here, but did you explore other classes of polyolefins like linear low density polyethylene or polypropylene? And if so, what happens with those polyolefins?
Yeah, so far we haven't. And we focused on HDPE because that's the one that I kind of view as the hardest one, because you just have CH2s and CH3s. The melts tend to generate highly viscous sort of slurries. We have not tried linear low density or anything like that yet. I suspect it would work here. Polypropylene, we don't know. We've tried polypropylene and it doesn't seem to work as well as polyethylene. And I don't think that's too surprising. It's a different structure of the polymer. It's got a ton of methyl groups. So that's something we don't totally understand yet. This tantalum hydride, in the interest of full disclosure, is like one of the most sensitive things that we've ever worked with. If it even thinks that it's close to O2 or H2, it deactivates. So some of these we're trying to figure out with respect to deactivation as well. So we don't really know yet, and that's something we're still exploring as far as how this behaves with other polymers.
Yeah, I guess what I'm more interested in is not so much does it work. I guess isotactic polypropylene is I think a challenge for all functionalization, and as you see these papers coming out, it's more challenging. It's a different beast, as you've said.
Yeah.
More crowded, and there's all kinds of stuff that could be going on. But I was with the different classes of polyethylenes, you have all kinds of different branch structures, right? So I'm curious about what are the products that you would get out of the hydrogenolysis or the alkane metathesis, since there's, you know, linear high density polyethylene is much more, you know, not less, far less structurally diverse than the other polyolefin classes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And that's a good point. I mean, that's something that I should probably put a little more pressure on Jiaoxin to try, because I don't know, but you would expect that you would get more branched products in those cases just because there's more branches.
Yeah, if you can isolate highly branched structures, right, those are really valuable fuel additives, right?
Yeah.
So like tryptane, for example, right, is a good jet fuel additive. And so that'd be pretty cool if you could convert low density polyethylene into jet fuel additive. That would be definitely an upcycling of polyolefins, in my opinion.
No, you're absolutely right. That would be super cool. One of the things we've been focused on is actually trying to control these distribution of products. And I don't think you can actually do it through the hydrogenolysis mechanisms. So we're trying to leverage some of the specific chemistry that tantalum can do, that's related to some of the alkane metathesis reactivity, to see if we can game this to go one way or the other. We don't have anything yet, but I think that the benefit that we have working with tantalum over zirconium, where most of the community is that it does do this alkane metathesis and forms different intermediates, where maybe we can get to something that maybe won't make tryptane, but could maybe selectively make, you know, propane. You know, if you can selectively make propane, you've just solved a problem, because you can take propane and make it propylene pretty easily.
Right.
But no, thank you for the suggestion. I think those are really great suggestions and things we need to look at with this system.